Now, I'm here as the former president of the Business Council, and the topic of the session is economic and trade relations. So when I threw together my thoughts this morning, I just subtitled this, Some Informing Considerations and Questions. Number one, is China a standalone policy question? You know, we all talk about, this is a group of China people, however we characterize them, but, you know, we're all sort of know each other and are China managers of one kind or another. And most of us have spent a lot of our time, because we studied China and focused on China, thinking about China policy. And certainly the United States has had major policy issues to deal with in regard to China. And I wouldn't for a minute say that we shouldn't have concerns about policy toward China. But I have two ambivalences about that. One is, everybody who is out of office accuses somebody who is in office of not having a China policy. The Dems will say the Bush White House doesn't have a China policy. They do, you know, and the same could be said certainly in the chaotic years of Clinton moving all around on China. It's a standard canard of those not in power that you say to the ones who are in power, at least in the China field, they don't have a China policy. My question is, I mean, let's sometime in another seminar talk about what it really means to have a China policy. My feeling is that in addition to thinking about China and what our policy should be toward China, there are other contexts which are inseparable from this. Tom Christensen embodies that by the fact that he worked in a bureau of the State Department, which is an East Asia bureau. And I think in some ways the concept of an Asia policy or an East Asia policy is as viable and as valid a concern for Americans in the policy-making sector to think about as a China policy per se. So as I get a little further from Washington, D.C., I get a little more skeptical about the kind of focusing in and hammering in on having a China policy as some sort of intellectual standalone device. It's hard, of course. I mean, you could say that everything in the world, all phenomena, are interrelated, and the cows eating the grass, you know, in Port Townsend, Washington, where I live today, are somehow related to having a China policy. I don't mean to get too metaphysical about this. I'm incapable of being metaphysical, but I do think that there's almost we can go to excess in saying we have to have a China policy, when in fact China is, especially now, part of a much wider world. Maybe in the old days when China was China and, you know, sort of self-contained, it was okay to have a China policy, but China is the world now, and so are we, and it may not be quite as necessary to be so obsessed with China policy now. Now, my next one was what drives U.S. policy making toward China. This is a subject of endless queries to me from Chinese journalists. You know, what is lobbying? What did business say? Who says what to whom? We could get into a broad discussion of what drives a policy making toward China. But my own view, and I'll move forward on this, is that economic activity is part of it. Social concerns are definitely part of it. Intra-congressional politics are part of it that have nothing to do with China in some cases, but are expressed in terms of alliances or behaviors on China. Party politics drive it in some cases. The range of possibilities is enormous, and it is a mistake if anybody dreams of saying so, to think that there is one single or that there are two or even three drivers of U.S. China policy. It's an amorphous process in which business and economic relations have their role, and certainly I took part in that when I was living and working in Washington, but in which there are a great many actors, and actors in individual congressional districts, actors in congressional leadership, actors in congressional committees, and then, of course, actors all around the U.S. executive branch, including sometimes actors involved in complex relationships between cabinet agencies and the White House and so forth. Do economic and trade relations have anything to do with other issues, said I, as an obvious rhetorical point. Yes, they do. And the one that I left Washington most concerned about, and still am, is the seeming disconnect between the security sector and the trade sector. I mean, business just basically doesn't want to talk about the security sector and doesn't even want to think about it in most cases. They say, look, I mean, you know, if we argue for, if we get into the security sector, we're going to be told we have no standing. This is, you know, we're novices, we don't have the right to talk, to have opinions, and moreover, we'll be accused of selling American interests down the river in order to make more money. So don't bother us with the security stuff. Well, after the NTR, the PNTR debate, in 2000 and 2001. And the subsequent debate that summer over a bill by Senator Thompson that would have been very punitive toward China on security issues. And in the aftermath, a year or two before, of Lee Wen-ho and the Cox Commission and everything else, I convened with the U.S. China Business Council a business and security forum. And the first meeting, we had 60 or 70 people, and we brought people in from the Pentagon and from the NDU and people all over the defense sector. And, you know, after a year, we had the same 8 people, and I called the whole thing off. I mean, basically, it was, I could name names, and my friends from Washington would laugh about the usual suspects. But basically, business drifted away. You know, PNTR was off the table, and they just didn't want to think about it anymore. I remain very concerned as a personal matter, and that the evolution of the security relationship between the two countries is extremely relevant to business and economic relations, and it will not be overruled by business and economic relations. My own personal view is that at the end of the day, the security relationship and the security concerns will trump essentially anything else in American policy if it really comes to that. So yes, economic and trade relations do have something to do with it. Now, and we see it in obvious ways. When the Commerce Department sets out to decide on what constitutes a deemed export, Hank's going to go under the table now. Here we are at USC. Universities have advanced graduate students from all over the world. They go to advanced seminars in physics, Jay, don't they? They touch hardware. They see hardware. If a professor has a meeting with a graduate student, an advanced graduate student from the PRC, and he discusses certain subjects with that advanced graduate student, is that a violation of U.S. export control regulations? Now, it could be somebody from Somalia. There are a couple of other countries involved, but the PRC is the big kahuna here. There are ways in which regulations coming out of U.S. government agencies have a direct impact and a direct relevance to the conduct of American business and economic relations with China, because we have perfectly legitimate national security concerns and national security legislation and national security regulations. So the two are in fact interwoven, and people in certain sectors of the business community know that very well. But my general concern is with the disconnect between the two. Human rights, absolutely. Jeff Fiedler is a person I've fought with many times. I like Jeff a lot. He caught me walking down the street in Washington a few months ago and said, "Come on up and let's have a talk." So I went up to his office, and Jeff said to me, "Bob, you guys beat us. You just beat us cold in 1999 or 2000 or whatever it was. You defeated us, and that was the end of it." I disagree. I mean, you know, Jeff works for the AFL-CIO, or he did, and he's, as they said, a labor activist in the Democratic movement. Very interesting character. And Jeff basically said business rolled us, and you know, we lost the battle. I don't think it's anywhere near as simple as that, and as personally, at least, I think that business and economic issues remain very, very closely related in the American mind to both human rights and labor concerns. Terrorism speaks for itself. Everything is relevant to terrorism. Now I come to a worrisome question. Is there anything new in the discourse on U.S.-China trade and economic relations? Is there anything new, which goes to Hank's point that there's a certain kind of elephantine inevitability to things between the U.S. and China. Things just kind of grind along heavy footprint by heavy footprint because these are two gigantic, I'm going to mix my metaphors now, two gigantic engines which just kind of go their own way, and the patterns are pretty much in place. So I elaborated even more on the question, has the U.S.-China discourse as a whole become a dialogue of the deaf? Now, Tom was very reassuring this morning, and in fact, I'm really glad he spoke first and led us off, because Tom's portrayal of the U.S.-China engagement with these, not endless, but this multitude of government-to-government engagements in agencies you've never heard of talking to their colleagues in China, and most importantly in what Tom said, listening to each other. That is, the United States actually listens to the Chinese. If that's true, I think that's really phenomenal. I have tended to be a little more skeptical. I mean, we in the Washington sector are in fact the usual suspects. There are a few 35-year-olds kind of entering the mix, but by and large, everybody knows everybody, even if you're politically opposed. I felt, even before leaving D.C., it's one reason I left D.C., that there was a certain kind of repetitive sameness to the U.S.-China dialogue, flavored now by profound cynicism. Profound cynicism. a perfectly clear understanding that every candidate for president from the party out of office is going to whack China during the campaign, and that not a hell of a lot's going to happen once he gets into office on the Chinese side. And a profound cynicism on the American side that no matter what the Chinese say, by definition, there are multiple agendas and multiple meanings, and nothing can be taken at face value. Cynicism deepened and still deepened when you see the Chinese controlling the media and saying we will not discuss food safety during the Olympics. It's off the table. It's a prohibited topic. That is, the levels of sort of kind of grinding, well, I mean, I keep coming back to the word cynicism, between the two sides has grown to a high level now. And my concern is, I hope Tom is right. I hope Secretary Paulson is successful. I really, really do. We've got big issues to deal with. But my sense has been that between the bureaucracies and often among Americans and Chinese, when you get beyond the level of personal friendships and personal engagements on a campus or among Americans and Chinese of goodwill at a personal level, that we've fallen into these ruts now, and I'm not sure whether there's anything new under the sun in the discourse between the two sides. Tell me when I'm out of time, because I have a couple more points to make.
5 minutes.
5, that's fine. We're joined at the hip, yes. They own our T-bills. You know, we go to Walmart because money is tight and buy their goods at lower prices than we would if we had to go to Brooks Brothers or Williams-Sonoma. Yes, we're joined at the hip. Do we need, and this is a personal reference from my own back problems, do we need chiropractic? Remember, we're joined at the hip. Do we need chiropractic, surgery, physical therapy, wellness, or talk therapy? In other words, yes, we are joined at the hip. We have this very complex relationship. Economically, they can't be pulled apart. But do we need kind of manipulation and kind of reorientation through sort of manual adjustments of things? Do we need radical surgery like a 25%, 27.5%? Tariff on Chinese goods because they won't revalue the RMB. Do we need physical therapy, which is the sort of easiest thing to do? You get up and you do your exercises on your own every morning and improve yourself, and that actually contributes to improving the relationship, the hip-to-hip relationship with the other side. Do we need wellness? I'm not into wellness, but I live in a town which is totally into wellness, and I could discuss wellness with you for the next 10 hours. And do we need talk therapy? Talk therapy, I don't mean to say that Secretary Paulson is engaged in talk therapy, but you could argue that in fact, we all say, look, why go to war? We should talk to each other. And maybe in fact, on all of these issues where we're joined at the hip so uneasily on the economic stuff, with all the social uneasinesses that lie behind that in Appalachia and Ohio, and all over the United States, and many in China as well, as they see foreigners and Americans getting too big a piece of their economy. Do we just need to keep talking and talking and talking in the hopes that it will lead us to some amelioration of the frictions that come with being joined at the hip? I suppose we do. Was there ever a unipolar moment? Who was that? Krauthammer? Was there ever a unipolar moment? Has it passed, and what does its passage portend for U.S.-China economic and trade relations? Nina Hachigian and Mona Sutphin put out a very interesting paper a couple of months ago from the Stanley Foundation, dealing, like as many others have done in recent years, with the apparent passing of whatever the unipolar moment might have been. I have a slightly different, it's a really good paper, I recommend it to you. My feeling has been over the last few years that the problem with being the sole remaining superpower at the top of the mountain, in your own conception, is that once you're there, it dawns on you like yin dawning on yang, that the only way to go from there is down. In other words, once you're at the top of the mountain, you suddenly look around and think, oh my God, there's no place else to go, only down. And everybody else that comes close to you is obviously seeking to get up to your place on the mountain and possibly to displace you. There's a strange psychological kickback, a built-in kickback to the moment when you look around the world and say, we're number one, we own the place. And so, in some ways, I think the passage of the unipolar moment, if it goes to the question of the way America looks at itself, is the best thing that could possibly happen to the United States. It will get us out of this kind of sense that the world is upside down if we're no longer able to just kind of pull strings and make things happen, which is clearly the case. one minute or yeah, we'll finish it off on that. But it's something to consider because China is obviously, in everybody's views, China is the big challenger, already the accomplished rebutter, you might say, to the notion of the unipolar moment. Is China still the great frontier for business? Is the business environment changing for better or worse? Well, what is China's future in the U.S. economy? We can get into it in discussion. Business looks on China still with a great deal of optimism, but there are problems, and Hank touched on them. For many American businesses that are now well established in China with investments and fairly large labor forces and so forth, there are issues. Costs have gone up, thanks to a Chinese labor law that even the AFL-CIO thought pretty well of. At the same time, this sense which comes out of the blogs and the internet and the Chinese published media that foreigners are getting too powerful in the Chinese economy and are causing China to be too vulnerable to the ups and downs of foreign corporate interests or of the global economy is a strong one now. And needless to say, the events of the last 2 months in the United States don't help us on that. I mean, this is not the place to wax on about the strength of America's mandate when we tell the Chinese how they ought to run their financial system, which we've been doing for the last 15 or 20 years. But you can forgive the Chinese if they view many of the sort of verities and truths that American business brings to China with a little more skepticism now than they did before we all lost 40% of our retirement funds. On that note, even though I have a few more notes here, I will look forward to some discussion with you all. Thank you.